So, I'm curious to know what you guys discussed in your breakout groups. There was three points of inquiry on the table. Who wants to share what was discussed?
We talked about how in the first question it said that that it was like dangerous to translate, you know, words from other places to English and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Ron. And he said there's a violence that takes place when you transfer anything from one culture to another. Absolutely. Who else wants to share?
I can share. We talked about we talked about the obstacles that he faced. We believe the obstacles where he was trying to fit into two different societies
Hmm.
since he got taken from one and he had to go to the other. So we believe that was the obstacle. And we talked about the things that he finds the issue with the Western culture that we live in today, like the disconnection from our ancestors and the things that we place our values in that aren't necessarily the best.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you took a little bit step further, but you're absolutely right. And actually, as I get through my notes, we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. Who could kind of speak to some of the threads that they found or the similarities that they found between this week's readings and the readings of the previous week? Any connections made between this reading, the teaching of Ptahhotep, and the readings that we had on Ma'at? Go ahead, Khalil.
From my understanding, it's like previous readings were like the quote unquote like rule book, for lack of better words, on how like, the traditions were carried out and how like life should be like lived according to not right.
Mm-hmm.
And then this reading is just that in relation to European society or like Western society.
Okay.
Right. So that's just how I like understood it.
Yeah, I can see that, right? So what I'm gathering from you, Khalil, is like it's a juxtaposition. Excuse me, a juxtaposition. So we were
Correct.
getting
Yeah.
teaching about Ptahhotep in the way that he saw that societies should operate. We got the readings about Ma'at and how Ma'at structures society in a certain way, and what from Khalil saying what Maladoma Patrice May is doing, he's doing a juxtaposition between the Western world and how his indigenous African culture performs society. So yeah, that's definitely a good call out. I'm very curious also, the third point of inquiry. When you guys talked about your talents, your gifts, your attributes, how can that help you fulfill your purpose? If you didn't have those talents, gifts, or attributes, why do you think I would have you? Why would you think I would ask that question of you? Who would like to share? No
I
thoughts on
think
that? Go ahead.
you asked the question because we all have talents and attributes that we have been given or blessed with, and they all serve to serve a certain greater purpose or finding who we are and who we are as people. I think that's why it's so important to know what our personalities are, our greatest traits, because it goes to that greater overall purpose
Absolutely.
and who
Yep, you hit the nail on the head, right? So if we think about how the reading starts off and how Maladoma articulates what his name means, right? And how his name signifies his purpose in life. And this is how the Dagara culture operates. The Gara culture is out of Burkina Faso in West Africa. So, in our understanding of life, in our iteration of reality, we don't operate to where, not all of us, I'm not going to say universally, right? I'm not going to make a whole generalization, but for the most part, we don't operate with the premise that your name is going to signify your destiny. Now, some of us may, right? Um, Typically, those who have ethnic sounding names, there's a purpose behind that name. There's a reason behind that name. There's a meaning behind that name, right? In the West, we don't really do that as much. So, because we don't attribute the names to help you fulfill your destiny, this is where those talents, those attributes, and those gifts come in, right? Because The Creator, God, the Most High, Allah, whatever you so choose to call them, gave you those to help you fulfill this bigger purpose that Amir is talking about, right? So let me get into my notes. Thank you guys for sharing. This book that you read, which is the introduction of the book, is titled Of Water in the Spirit, Ritual Magic and Initiations in the Life of an African Shaman. The author is Malidoma Patrice Somé. As I mentioned, he's out of the area of Burkina Faso. So how I got introduced to this reading. I was doing my undergrad at Cal State LA. I was in the Pan-African Studies class, and we had a guest speaker. The guest speaker so happened to be the current chair of the Pan-African Studies Department, Dr. Nana Lawson Bush. And he had us do this exercise, right? And he divided the class up into two groups, the red group and the blue group. And we were assigned to come up with a system that would completely subjugate and oppress the other group, right? So if you're on the red team, you need to come up with a system that will completely oppress the blue team. If you're on the blue team, you're going to come up with a system that will completely oppress the red team. This was the assignment, right? So we go through the exercise, yada, yada, yada. And me and my hubris, I'm like, yo, I think I know what you're doing, right? Red team, blue team, Africans, Europeans, right? And the only way for us as African people to overcome the system of oppression is to tap back into our Africanity, right? Go back into our African customs, right? This was my response to the exercise. And his response to me was, yeah, that sounds good, right? But I don't believe your mind is ready to receive all that Africa is. Your understanding of reality won't be able to reach the depths of African reality. What I suggest you do is read this book, right? So I read the book, and he was right. It fucked me up. What they were talking about in the book does not relate to our understanding of reality. So in the opening introduction, he talks about, in very brief passing, right, his grandfather's funeral ceremony. But in the actual book, in the chapter where he details the happenings of his grandfather's ceremony, there's things that happen there that y'all would not believe, right? So his father makes his transition, or what you guys may call he dies, right? And he stays within his compound for 3 days. After that 3-day window goes by, the elders from the community come by. They have these big vases, and they start to pour these herbs in them, start to mix up the vases. And like a smoke starts to fill where the grandfather is laying, right? So Malidoma is watching this all go down, and he says the elders walk away from the pots, but the pots continue to stir on their own, right? And then the pots go from the ground to the ceiling. So now they're up on the ceiling, stirring themselves, okay? This is his first-hand account. This is what he says he saw happen. And so they take some of the contents of the pot, put it around the grandfather's bed. The grandfather raises up out of his deathbed. So he's sitting up, right? They bring in more elders. They start beating drums. They start singing chants, right? The grandfather catches the beat, hops out of the bed, and starts to dance his way 2 miles to where he will be buried, right? So again, in our understanding, once you dead, you dead. You ain't getting up out the grave, or you ain't getting up out of where you died at and start dancing. That's not going to happen, right? But according to the Dagara and the way that they understand reality, this is what they do. This is how they send off those who are high-ranking officials in their community to the other side, right? So again, what we think we know about Africa is a lot deeper than what we can understand, right? So he starts off the chapter by telling us his name, what his name means, to be friends with strangers or the enemy, right? And then he tells you that the Dagara believe that every individual comes into this life with a special destiny. A person's life project is therefore inscribed in the name he or she carries, right? So every time I say your name, Ryan, that's to help you to remember that you have a purpose that's bigger than just you, right? Every time I say your name, Heather, there's a purpose that you have that's bigger than just what you think you have, right? And that's why they give you these names, to constantly remind you of your purpose. It almost operates as a mantra, right? And then he goes in to say that the greatest obstacle he encountered while writing the text is the translation from African happenings to English, right? Because there's things that happen in Africa that the English language does not have words for, right? So as best as I try to articulate to you his grandfather's funeral ceremony, there's words in English that just won't articulate that, right? And this is where he says that obstacle comes into place. And this is where he says the violence that ensues when you transfer something from one culture to the next. And then I was also attentive to the fact that how his understanding or his interpretation of Western Christianity's God, right? Because he tells you he was kidnapped from his village and took into a French Jesuit seminary school for 15 years, right? And he says, they taught me all the white man's knowledge, history, architecture, science, mathematics, etc., etc. But he says all these topics were presented with a good dose of Christianity and its temperamental God, who forced everyone to live in constant fear of his wrath, right? So there's two things at play. One, because of Malidoma being an outsider to Christianity, right, he has a separate understanding of God. The way that the God performs in the Dagara culture is vastly different from the angry, what he calls temperamental God that makes everyone afraid of his wrath, right? So there's a juxtaposition at place. And I read this, I thought to the conversation that we had in this class about how God is being positioned by different people based on their reality, right? He also says, I know especially why my people have such a deep respect for old age. So for the Dagara, the elders and the youth, the babies, have the highest importance or the highest reverence in their community. The reason being, the elders and the babies are the closest to the ancestors. Why would I say that the elders and the babies are the closest to the ancestors? Why do you think that the baby? Go ahead.
I think or do you mean old people? Because yeah, so basically old people need help just as much as babies, I guess. I don't know. That's true though too, because you have to take care of old people and you have to take care of babies, but I don't know what the ancestors, basically.
Yeah. So yes, you're absolutely right, Bianca. Those are the similarities between the elders and babies, right? It's like the circle of life. You come out of the womb, you need help, and you're on your way back to the other side, you're gonna need some help. But if you think about the ancestors, right? What are ancestors? Zachary, do me a favor, say that out loud, please.
Okay, well, I kind of thought they're closer to birth and death in a way. So that's why I feel like they're closer to the ancestors.
Absolutely. So when you're a baby, right, you're coming out of the womb. So you're coming from the ancestral realm, to this realm, right? And as you're an elder, you're getting closer and closer and closer to your transition into becoming an ancestor, right? And so one thing, in African culture, in indigenous African culture, the concept of death is not really a thing. That's why if you notice, I rarely will use that. I say, which y'all may call death, right? We'll call it a transition. Because you transition from this physical life, from this fleshly life, to the spiritual realm, right? So it's not a death, but it's a transition. And then also why this becomes important is because those who are closest to the ancestors have a direct line of communication with the ancestors. So their insight becomes very important, right? But then he also goes on to say, and why a strong, functioning community is essential for the maintenance of individuals' sense of identity, meaning, and purpose, right? So the community becomes very important for the Dagara. Just like how we talked about in Ma'at, you cannot say, I have a good conscience. Just because I say I have a good conscience, the community has to come into that understanding as well, right? Just like the example I gave with manhood. I cannot say that I'm a man, right? I have to go through these certain steps that the community understands to say that, yes, you are a man. Same as here with the Dagara, right? Community is important because that's going to help you realize and fulfill your destiny. And then on page 4, well, before I get to that, let me ask you, what is the tension at play within the reading. And Amir kind of mentioned it earlier, but there's a tension at play. What is that tension? There's a tension, there's a beef, there's a rivalry at play. What is that? From a standpoint of culture, there's two cultures that are operating and they're at tension with one another. What are the two cultures?
I would think it would be like progress versus like tradition.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep. Or we could say, right, indigenous African culture, which is, as Zachary would put it, tradition, versus the West, right, which we would understand as progress, okay? And he says that originally his ancestors are looking at these Europeans coming to Africa and everything that they touch, they burn, right? They come in, they decimate the Dagara culture. They come in and they decimate the Dagara land, right? They come in and they decimate the Dagara lifeways. So as they're trying to make sense of what's going on and these people who are coming in, they come to the realization that either A, these people they fucked up their land so bad that they're coming over here to fuck up ours, or they have such a divisive relationship with their ancestors that they're out of pocket and they're creating turmoil, right? But then Malidoma notices as he gets older and he starts to travel abroad, and he says, well, there's a shift that takes place. And now the Western world is not concerned with colonizing foreign lands, but preserving foreign cultures. And then he makes the claim. Anytime the conversation shifts to preservation of culture, that opposing culture is already become an endangered species. Here's why. Once the West starts talking about preserving your cultures, your shit gonna start coming up missing, right? Your artifacts may end up in their museums. Your art may end up in their museums. Your resources may fund their enterprises, right? So at that point, it's really not about them preserving your culture, it's about them taking your culture and in turn making you an endangered species. I was also very attentive to his talisman, right? That little pouch that he got that allowed him to get into college, that allowed him to pass his exams in college, right? So the ability of indigenous African technology, right, allowing him to be successful in the Western world of so-called progress. I found that to be interesting. And then he makes a claim on page 7 that I don't necessarily agree with. And I'll read it to you, and you guys could think about whether you agree with this or not. He says on the the opening paragraph on page 7, here in the West, I have a great deal of time for spiritual contemplation and study, and much more time to share things of the spirit with others. If I were still living in my village in Africa, nearly every spare moment would be taken up with scratching a living from the exhausted soil that is all colonialism has left us with. So I'm gonna ask y'all, how many of y'all have time for spiritual contemplation? Y'all have extracurricular time to do things like that?
What, meditate?
Meditate, think about ideas of the spirit. Just sit back and think and do nothing but think.
All the time.
Nah. Because you have school, you have work, you have families, right? You have all these other things going on to maintain your life in this Western world or to advance your position in this Western world. So for me, I don't know if I can agree with Malidoma, right? Because what I think about who Malidoma is and what Malidoma does, right? He's an educator. He's an author. He's a spiritual advisor, right? So it's not the fact that he's in the West that allows him the time for spiritual contemplation. His occupation allows him the time for spiritual contemplation, right? So I have to disagree with that. And I think this is helpful for y'all as students. You don't have to believe everything you read, right? In fact, it's a good practice to take the opposing position of what you're reading and try to intellectually work your way to the author's conclusion, right? This is a great critical practice on how to engage material. He lays out his thesis on page 8 of the book as a whole, right? And he tells you, what I'm attempting to share with you in this book is only one of the endless versions of reality. So what that lets me know, he believes there's multiple versions of reality. And truly, he'll tell you that language will dictate your understanding and your version of reality, right? And he goes on to say that there's no word or concept for the supernatural in Dagara culture, right? The supernatural is so natural for them that they don't have a word for it, right? And then he talks about the social experiment that he does with Star Trek. And he shows his elders the Western world's depiction of their future, right? So Star Trek is what the West thought the future would look like. But for the elders, they're like, yo, what the fuck is this? Ain't nothing. This is what we do all the time, right? Spock, this little pointed ear motherfucker, we have a whole bunch of them people. We call them the quantum bled, right? So this, because of this, he questions this notion of advancement, right? He questions this notion of who is really primitive, right? And he says, well, before I go there, not only in the Dagara culture is there no concept or word for the supernatural, he says there's a close connection between thought and reality. Again, there's a close connection between thought and reality, right? To imagine something, to closely focus one's thoughts upon it, has the potential to bring that something into being. So like in the early 2000s, there was like a documentary that was picking up a lot of press called The Secret. And essentially what The Secret was about was the ability to think about something, to speak onto something, to put action behind something, and that will become your reality, right? And this became like this whole new age thing going into the early 2000s all the way up to about 2010, right? But Maladoma is telling you like, nah, yo, this ain't science. This is not new science. It's not new thought. This is something that African people have been doing since the beginning of time, right? Your thoughts are closely tied to your reality, okay? And then, so taking it back to his experiment with Star Trek, right? He makes the claim, the irony of the West sees the indigenous world as primitive and archaic. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the West would learn to be as archaic as my elders, right? Because what the West sees as their future in Star Trek, again, is the current reality of the Dagara society. So who's really primitive, right? Who's a really advanced society? And then to pick up again the juxtaposition between the Western world and the indigenous Dagara society, he states, it is my belief that the present state of restlessness that traps the modern individual has its roots in a dysfunctional relationship with the ancestors. And I find that to be true, right? And if you think about most indigenous cultures, whether they be Asian cultures, whether it be indigenous culture to the Americas, whether it be African indigenous cultures, they all exhibit very strong ties to the ancestors, right? In the text, he talks about some Asian person becoming the president of that country, and they had to go to their ancestral temple before they took the throne, right? I think about movies like Coco, which essentially is a movie about honoring your ancestors, right? Making sure your grandma is up on the altar, right? In the African context, in my household, I have an ancestral shrine, right? In my household, we do rituals to our ancestors, and we leave Igbo to my ancestors, right? I leave a plate of food for my ancestors because I reverence their presence, right? In the Western world, that's not a thing. They don't, for the most part, give that honor and that reverence to ancestors. And then he makes the final claim to close out the chapter. Let me ask you, what is alienation? How would you define alienation? If you can't understand what alienation is, think about the root word of alienation.
To be like, to stand out or be excluded.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to read the passage, right? He says, alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. So when you hear modernity, there's two ways to think about this term. One is just what's the modern, right? So we're living in a modern world. So we're existing within modernity, okay? But from a historical epic standpoint, modernity is literally when the European world became world powers, right? When the Greco-Roman Empire took over as world power, that is the start of this iteration of modernity, okay? So alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. The cure is communication and community, a new sense of togetherness. By opening to each other, we diminish the pressure of being alone and exiled. So, if you read closely to what he's talking about, this is the thread between all three readings that we've engaged so far. This new sense of togetherness, right? How to combat alienation, this notion of relation, right? What Ptahhotep was concerned with, creating the Meter Nefer so society could relate with one another well, right? Ma'at is set in place so that we can live and create heaven on earth so we can relate to one another well, right? How Malidoma sees us overcoming alienation is by creating a new sense of togetherness. This notion of relation is the central theme, really, of these past 3 weeks, having us rethink about the way that we relate to one another, okay? So those are my notes for the reading. Let's jump into our fishbowl. So again, you could pull from the breakout rooms. You could literally read your journal. You could talk about what was discussed in my notes. All of that is on the table. We'll do 4 people at most. Does anybody want to volunteer?
I'll
I
go.
will.
Okay, got me. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the other voice. Who was the other one? Who was that?
Bianca.
Bianca. Thank you, Bianca.
I'll go as well.
I'm sorry, who was the other one?
Keisha.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you, Marquisha. Is there one more? All right, that's cool. We can do 3. So whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
In the text, I saw that like what his value was like elderly people. Like he looked up to elderly people because he said the best degree I hold is the one that my elders have given me. And he also said he goes back to get cleansed by his elders. So I was like, that's what he basically in all the texts, they all how do I say it?
Yep.
They all have a value, they all value something in all the texts.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would want to say with him bringing up the ancestors a lot, he was mentioning how like trying to compare the Western life with the modern life. Like he was saying how the ancestors would have to be good within, if they're not good with their people, like it's gonna haunt them. Like if you're not good with the people that you're with, modern life, he said people that they don't want to deal with their ancestors because the things that they've done, they just don't want to deal with it.
Very good point. I want to touch on that later, but I want to get through the fishbowl first.
Okay.
For me, I found the story. I made a lot of comparisons as I read it to how we are today as African people in America. He had came to America and he saw a lot of things. He talks about the ways in which we live life and how we should live life. Now, African Americans that were forced to be here, they have to live a certain life and then forget about all these things. We don't have the connection with our ancestors and this, that, and the third due to the lifestyle that we're forced to live. I found that very interesting. I also found it interesting how he talked about other African people. He brought up African people a lot, but he talked about how they had sort of forgotten their ways to fit in. And the things he was doing were exaggerated or weird because here he is wearing a tribal suit where other Africans are wearing a 3-piece suit. So I found all that very, very, very interesting and how his comparison to how it is here and how the similarities between the modern African American and how he lived his life are very similar, from the fact of him getting taken from his home and then not being accepted back and everything else that goes with that.
Yeah. You know, I think your music on the attire is very important, right? Because he says, like, because I'm educated, everybody back home in Africa expects me to show up in a 3-piece suit with a tie, right? And if I came with my dashiki on, they're gonna look at me like I'm tripping, you know? And really what I interpreted from that is value, right? So even for those in Africa, they value Western ideals, Western dress more than they do their own, right? And if you're an educated person, there's no way in hell that you're about to show up with this dashiki on, right? Because that's not the appropriate culture to value now, especially because you're educated, right? And Makisha's your mentionings of the ancestors and Malidoma saying that, you know, the West, they don't want to deal with the actions of their ancestors. We see that being played out very clearly right now, right?
Yes, I do. I can agree
Speak
with
on
that.
that. Yeah. Why do you say so? Speak on that, Makisha.
I would say that maybe because people don't want to deal with the reality. That's a lot of what the issue is in today is Arab. They don't want to deal with the reality of things. They want to cover things up, or for instance, if I can give an example, how they use social media as a distraction on what's really going on. That's why it's really good to stay in touch of if you can have someone around you that's letting you know the real, or you paying attention to what's really going on. That's why it's called, for instance, television, because they're telling you a vision of what's going on.
We call it television.
Yeah, that's exactly what my dad says.
And also, right, what is the conversation going on right now around critical race theory? Is anybody familiar with that? When you can Google critical race theory, because one, y'all might not even know what the fuck critical race theory is. So critical race theory is a science or a theory that comes out of law schools, right? In the mid 90s, I believe it becomes popular. And what it does, it takes a critical outlook on things like history, right? So from a critical race theory perspective, they'll say that Christopher Columbus didn't discover America, right? So a component of critical race theory is called counter storytelling. So counter storytelling would do, we're not going to tell the story of American discovery from Columbus's vantage point. We're going to tell that story from the indigenous people who were here first, right? So this is a component of critical race theory. So right now, there's a lot of conversations around getting critical race theory banned in K through 12 education, right? Because they feel it's teaching racism against white folks, it's teaching anti-patriotism, right? And that's not what it's doing at all. Furthermore, it's not even in K through 12. If anything, you would engage critical race theory in college, because again, this comes out of law schools, okay? It is there is a class here that we teach on critical race theory. I actually taught it on one of the summer intercession courses. But I bring this up because all this is America not wanting to deal with the actions of their ancestors. That's all this is about. They don't want the truth about the travesties, about the malicious activities that was done to create this nation that they're so proud of, right? So they'll say, we need to ban this from schools. They're literally preventing the truth from being told in your K through 12 education. And you wonder why the same shit that we're dealing with in 1960s, we're still dealing with in 2021. They don't want to deal with the atrocities of their ancestors. Thank you guys for the fishbowl. The guys brought up some really good points. So with the time we have left, let's engage in some conversations about the readings. Anything's on the table? Who wants to kind of share their thoughts about the reading?
I forgot to add that he mentioned a lot about the reality and imagination, comparing the two. So I thought that was a really good point that he made. Even like I was comparing it to today's era, how we, like I said, it's the reality and imagining things. And he even actually gave a really good definition to it, which really stood out to me. So I wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and I think also, Mike, you should he's really pointing out that there's not so much separation between your imagination and reality.
Exactly.
Your imagination shapes reality, and that's
exactly. It's like a manifesting in a way, to be honest.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Has anybody heard of the science of alchemy? There's a book called The Alchemist, but it derives from this ancient science. And in historical times, alchemists would be able to manipulate metal and change matter, right? Back to this notion of manifesting, okay? Follow me, I'm gonna work my way back. In my lifetime, I have experienced alchemy, right? I've done alchemist things, right? Me before you guys right now is an example of my alchemy. when I was doing my undergrad, I got about halfway through. I stopped, started doing other shit, trying to get money, right? And then my fiance got pregnant, okay? And I'm like, shit, I gotta get my life together, right? And I'm gonna get back in school. Let me finish my bachelor's and try to figure out how to make some income. So as I'm navigating this process, I'm like, yo, I should teach. That's something that I could do, right? That's something that my talents, my abilities, and my gifts will speak well to, right? And I'm going through this process. And once I really got my mind situated on this notion of being a professor, I started visualizing myself as a professor, right? Even before I was done with my bachelor's, I would literally lay in bed and visualize myself hopping on the train, walking up them stairs, going to class, setting up the lecture. I would go through that much detail in my visualizations of what I would be doing in my near future, okay? Lo and behold, what am I doing? I'm in front of you doing just what I thought my imagination, what I wanted to do, right? But here's where it gets deeper. As I got into this and I started to do the work, I was like, yo, this is more than just an occupation. This is more than just a paycheck, right? This is my life's purpose. And it's not to be a professor. That's not what my purpose is, right? But it's to be in front of y'all and be able to kind of shift the way that you view the world, the way that you view yourselves, right? To take this type of information that I've came across that allowed me to shape my world and give it to you so you can shape your world. To help you understand, manifest, and fulfill your purpose, right? And that's why I tell y'all very bluntly, I'm not interested in y'all grades. I'll give you your grade. You're going to get your grades, right? Because I know that's why you're here. But it's so much bigger than that for me, right? If I could get you to move at least 1 inch closer to your purpose, then I know I'm fulfilling my purpose. So this is your homework for the rest of the semester and the rest of your life. Carve out some time for spiritual contemplation. Carve out some time to think about your gifts, your talents, and how they can move you to your purpose. If you're fortunate enough to understand your purpose, then pursue that purpose. Think back to the teaching of Ptah. Live your heart's desires, right? For your whole life. This is what, I'm paraphrasing, but this is what it's telling you, right? This is what I'm reinforcing to you. Find your purpose and pursue that purpose. Everything will be laid before you. The ancestors will put people in your path that will allow you to actuate your purpose. The ancestors will open up doors that you never thought about walking in. The ancestors will put your name on the lips of people who will put your names in rooms that you've never been in. Once you start to live for your purpose, the doors will be open for you. The path will be cleared for you. This is why we meditated. That's one activity that you could do that will get you to tap into yourself, that could get you to manifest your destiny, your reality, your purpose. So this is your homework assignment. Another part of your homework assignment that's due in a week, right? It speaks to the tension at play within the two texts. The two worlds that we occupy, especially for marginalized or people of culture, right? Who's familiar with this idea or this notion of code switching? Who knows what code switching is or who's heard of that?
I've heard of it.
Can you explain for us what code switching is, please?
So what code switching is when me as an African American or anyone who lives in a lifestyle where it's not acceptable by society or public, they speak in a way, in a mannerism that pleases those around them. So therefore, if I was talking to y'all, I would just be like saying some random stuff. I drop the y'alls, this, that, this word. But if I'm speaking professionally, as they said, I would sit up more. I would speak more clearly. I would talk to you guys in a mannerism using bigger words and exaggerating my speech to make me sound like I'm more professional and more qualified to be doing what I'm doing.
Yep. Another way that in the Black community, we would articulate that, right? You're talking white, right? You put your white voice on for work, right? Code switching. For my bilingual students, you may speak Spanish at home, but if you go out in the store, you go into the classroom, you're leaving that Spanish at home, right? You're going to code switch to use a language that's more acceptable to the environment that you're about to occupy. What this speaks to is that tension at play between the two worlds, the Western world and the non-Western world. What this speaks to is this idea of values and prioritizing certain cultures over other cultures. So your homework is to not code switch. If you normally use a certain type of conversation when you're around certain people, stop doing that shit. Try it, see what happens, right? If you always speak English around this certain environment, throw some Spanish in there and see what happens, right? Now, don't get fucked up, don't get fired, right? Be smart about the way that you're gonna go about non-code switching, because code switching is very much a means of survival, okay? And this is why these cultures do this. But I want you guys to try to push that limit as much as possible and see what happens. The reason I talk to y'all the way that I do in classes is on purpose. It's part of my pedagogy, to show you that you could be your authentic self and still be professional, right? Who you are is professional, because who you are is perfect. Who you are is divine. So you shouldn't have to put on a separate voice just to be accepted. You shouldn't have to use a certain language to be accepted. You shouldn't have to not use your ethnic name and to use a European name so you think you could get a better chance at a job, right? These are all the things that we have been trained to do to subjugate ourselves to make others feel comfortable. Again, let's stop doing that, right? The goal is to get to a point to where you're no longer making yourself small to make others feel big. That's why we continue to deal with the same shit over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, because we don't want to make somebody feel uncomfortable. Let's not talk about this in our classrooms, because they may be unpatriotic. It's going to disturb my comfort, right? Later for that. When you go, for those who decide to go into grad school, right? The material that you're going to hear, oftentimes, especially for marginalized groups, is not going to support you. It's not going to build you up, right? When I transferred from Cal State LA to Claremont Graduate University, I was in a state of bewilderment because the way that they talked about African people, right? I come from a school of thought to where we recognize African people as the first people on the planet, dating back 8 million years old, right? A school of thought that recognizes all great African contributions, right? Only to transfer into a PhD program that by and large, through this understanding of this notion called modernity, that Black folks, African people, are only useful as slaves. And these are the conversations that I kept having in my PhD program over and over and over again, right? To the point I got tired of trying to defend our humanity as a people, right? So think about what it's like to go through that type of mental experience, but then also try to put on a certain face to make everyone else feel comfortable. They're not concerned with my comfort when they tell me that my people are nothing but slaves, right? They're not concerned about how comfortable does that make me feel. So what sense does it make for me to take their comfort in consideration juxtaposed to my own well-being? The tide must change, right? And another part of my task, another part of my duty is to disturb the normalcy of the academy, right? I know where I'm going into is an anti-Black environment, right? So I'm trying to get as many recruits as possible to help infiltrate this thought, infiltrate this space, right, with new thought. And you can only do that by being your true and authentic self. So try it out for a week. See how you feel when you don't code switch. Be attentive to how you feel, but also pay attention to how others respond around you, right? And what you'll typically find, in my experience, I'll put it this way, in my experience, I found in my experience that one of two things take place. For those who are uncomfortable, you show me who you really are, right? Or people are appreciative to the fact that you're being your authentic self. Those have been my two experiences. Those have been my two exchanges when I tried this. And it's not even a try, I live my life this way, right? I also found and I'm talking about while I'm a student at Claremont in my PhD program, a lot of my professors who are Black, when they hear me talk, when they hear me express myself and articulate, right, there's a level of comfort that comes over them. their conversation doesn't sound so professional as much. They start to talk the way that they really talk, right? So you'll be surprised on how your energy can shift and dictate the space that you walk into. This is the exercise or social experiment that will allow you to test that. Any questions, comments, or concerns to close this out? All right, let me show you real quick your readings for next week. So under weeks 4 through 7, we finished Sommeil, Water in the Spirit. So for next week, we're going to read Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. I'll email that out to you guys Thursday or Friday. But if you want to get started now, you could be able to find that here. Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. Before we go, thoughts on your homework assignment for next week. What are your thoughts about that?
Can you actually explain that one more time for me, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. So, Makisha, do you have a work voice?
Of course, it's being professional. So it's a time and place for everything.
Right. So maybe not at work, right? But try not to use your work voice sometimes and see what happens. So the task, to put it bluntly, when you normally code switch, don't, and see what happens. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all. So for my bilingual people, if you normally only speak English in a certain restaurant or a certain space, speak some Spanish, see what happens. But again, do it at a capacity to where you're safe. Do it at a capacity to where you can maintain your job, et cetera, et cetera. So thoughts on your homework assignment? No one has thoughts on what you've been tasked to do?
Makes me very anxious. That's about it. Just
Makes you
thinking
what?
about it. Anxious.
Anxious.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, Khalil. It shouldn't make you anxious, right? And it's not, that's not an indictment on you as a person. It's an indictment on society that says you cannot be yourself. You shouldn't feel nervous about being yourself all the time. There's something wrong with that. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. I'm curious, Heather, Jessica, how would you guys participate in this particular assignment?
I find myself code switching sometimes, even with family members.
Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, my older brother, I kind of see him as like an authoritative figure. So a lot of the times I find myself like checking my language, making sure I'm not cussing, like kind of just like whatever the topics I'm talking about, I'm more cautious about them. Like, so it gives me anxiety to feel like, okay, let me not filter myself so much for him. Like, what if he judges that or whatever? Yet at the same time, he's my brother. Like, so it shouldn't feel that way, like, and I don't really think he'd shame me, it's my own like hesitations, I guess, my own fears.
Yeah. What about you, Heather?
I've been trying to think about situations where I might, I don't know, not talk like myself. I would say that a lot of times I just mirror what other people are doing. Like if other people are talking in a professional sense, then I tend to try to as well. But when I'm around, say, my soccer team here at Cal State LA, a majority of them are Hispanic, and they aren't afraid to be themselves when they're in that environment. And so they're all talking in ways that, their accents come out, and they're making jokes and they're saying phrases in Spanish and stuff like that. And it's really fun to be around them. So my side of like joking around and everything comes out, but I'm still myself.
Yeah.
Just like adjusting to the environment.
Yeah. And I think too, right? Like oftentimes code switch is presented from a like an ethnic or racial standpoint, but it also could be right from a standpoint of sex, right? So because I'm a woman, I'm going to perform certain ways that women are expected to perform, right? Especially like in the highly machismo cultures, right? To where the dad is the authoritarian of the whole household, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to code switch your gender performance to fit within the household dynamics, right? So there's a lot of ways that we could think about this notion of code switching beyond just your racial background, right? But play with it, right? Play with it, but play with it in a way that's safe.